Welcome, everyone, and thank you for coming today. This is the 34th annual Bohlins Rees Hoffenberg Lecture Series, and my name is Davide Panagia. I'm the current chair of the Political Science Department. I always say current because it gives me a sense of time passing quickly. As many of you know, this series was inaugurated to celebrate the intellectual spirit of the three individuals who are its honorees: John Bohlins, John Rees, and Marvin Hoffenberg, all former distinguished professors in UCLA's Department of Political Science. This year, as always, we've been very fortunate to have the assistance and support of the Development Office in the Division of Social Sciences that, like many of the offices in the university, are struggling with managing the number of people occupying their staffing. And so I wanted to sort of give a quick shout out to Peter Evans, who is, because of this problem, literally in between three different events and will be coming in and out of three different events, as well as Hillary, who's outside, and especially Riaz Safi, who can't be here today because she's on parental leave right now, but she was the person, Sam, who coordinated all of this for us at the very beginning. And of course, I want to thank Belinda Sunu, who was just here, who is our coordinator in the Political Science Department and made sure that Sam arrived safely. As you may know, or some of you may know, the aim of this series is to help us reflect on how the worlds of academic inquiry and everyday politics can come together and collaborate to shed light on our shared commitments and intuitions about representative democracy. In this respect and many others, we're all exceedingly fortunate to have with us our distinguished speaker this evening, who boasts an extraordinary career of learnedness and reflections on some of the most challenging questions that confront American representative democracy. Samuel Friedman is professor of journalism at the Columbia Journalism School and former columnist at the New York Times, and he has written 10 books, enviable, the most recent of which is the one that he'll speak to us about today, Into the Bright Sunshine, published with Oxford University Press. His previous books, that include Small Victories, The Inheritance, and Breaking the Line, demonstrate a concentrated attention to the lived politics of everyday Americans, and how America's ever-changing political culture is interlaced with family struggles, childhood education, religious life, and the history of civil rights. I note as well that Small Victories was a finalist for the 1990 National Book Award, while The Inheritance was a finalist for the 97 Pulitzer Prize. In other words, Samuel Friedman is an author, a teacher, and a public voice who has looked closely and repeatedly at how Americans live the institutional and cultural dynamics of a representative democracy. And so, for this and for many other reasons, please join me in welcoming Professor Friedman as the 34th annual Bohlins Rees Hoffenberg Lecture, whose title today is Into the Bright Sunshine. You can stand up.
Thank you so much, Davide, and thanks to so many people at UCLA who've made this possible, and also a good longtime friend in writing, an Angelino, though not officially a UCLA person, Karen Stabiner, who can't be here because of illness, but was the person who put me in touch initially with Riaz Safi, and which led to the wonderful opportunity to be here. It's always important to me, as someone who's a product of public education, from kindergarten through my humble bachelor's degree, my terminal degree, I'm ashamed to say, in this august company, to speak on behalf of public ed, and especially the extraordinary institution of UCLA and the entire UC system. And even though I've made much of my academic life at Columbia University, which of course is a private institution, in the course of writing this book about Hubert Humphrey, I became formally attached to the University of Minnesota as a research scholar. So once again, I even have a formal foot in the world of public higher ed. And so that really makes me want to give you the best I can give you of my work tonight. And also, journalists, we always talk among ourselves about the imposter syndrome we feel trying to cobble up our expertise in time to make our deadline. The great writer Tom Wolfe used to speak about journalists going with their tin cups begging for people's truth. But there's a particular form of imposter syndrome to being among trained scholars. Because for me, I've been a historian wannabe, someone without the formal training. And so to be able to speak here in the memory of three extraordinary political scientists is a great honor, and one that I hope I'll prove worthy of this late afternoon, early evening. Also to be in Los Angeles. My daughter lives here. I'm proud to have her with me tonight. There's even a UCLA tie. My late uncle, Fred Friedman, was a music librarian at UCLA in the late 1960s. He was ABD, which is why he never got to be a professor of music, but he was a librarian here and also at Vassar and also at Case Western. But while he was here, Uncle Freddie, who was many things but not that much of a sports fan, once said to me, I have this student in my music class who is on the basketball team. His name is Lou Alcindor, and he's a really good student. And I'm now a subscriber to Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's wonderful Substack, which I highly recommend. And one of the weeks when he invited subscribers to ask questions, I sent a note to him about Uncle Freddie. And he didn't specifically remember, but he said it sounded like it probably had happened. So, so I'm glad to know that what Uncle Freddie told me was basically something that would pass the fact checkers. In any case, here tonight to give a talk out of this current book, Into the Bright Sunshine, Young Hubert Humphrey and the Fight for Civil Rights. And, you know, when we think about civil rights and a lot of the writing that's been done, including some excellent books, that story tends to begin in the mid-1950s. We think about Thurgood Marshall winning the Brown versus Board of Education case at the Supreme Court, leading to school segregation being struck down, or Dr. King and Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott a year later in 1955. And it's not that there's anything incorrect with situating a lot of vital civil rights activity in that decade, but it's an incomplete truth. And similarly, when we think about Hubert Humphrey, those of us who do remember him, people tend to think of the later and frankly discredited part of his political career when he was Lyndon Johnson's vice president, and as that photo makes manifest, often dominated by Johnson. When he, broke faith, it seemed, with his liberal followers in supporting the Vietnam War. When he became really an object of ridicule and disdain, getting the presidential nomination in 1968 amid the police riot against anti-war activists and journalists at the Chicago Convention, looking like the establishment's candidate, running for the Democratic nomination against the peace candidate George McGovern, his former protege, in 1972, and somehow appropriately dying extremely young at age 66. And people my age who remember reading Rolling Stone at that time will even remember the most infamous of the disses, a term that was not in use back then, of Hubert Humphrey, when Hunter S. Thompson, writing about him in the 72 campaign, said that Hubert Humphrey was campaigning, quote, like a rat in heat. And again, this very critical recall of Humphrey in the last decade or dozen years of his life is not incorrect. It's factually accurate, and the analysis holds up over time, but it's incomplete. And so I wanted to go and try to fill in this book and in the talk tonight, both a biographical gap and a historical gap. And the historical gap has to do with this amazing decade of civil rights activity in the 1940s, a decade in which the leaders weren't Dr. King, who was a child then, but people like A. Philip Randolph from the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and Walter White, the executive secretary of the NAACP at that time. And if you think he looks Caucasian, that's not mistaken. He was very fair-skinned, and one of the incredibly brave things Walter White did was go to the Deep South and pass as white in order to do reporting on the lynchings and other extrajudicial terrorism inflicted on black Americans at that time. And the civil rights movement of the 40s, as we'll hear later, was very much motivated by the sacrifices of black soldiers fighting for this country. and by their idea of what they call double V. You can see the logo in one of the photos. That meant double victory. First, victory over fascism abroad, and then victory over Jim Crow at home. And the great black newspaper, the Pittsburgh Courier, made that a national rallying cry for black Americans. And similarly, there's a whole part of Hubert Humphrey's life that even people who feel that they know Humphrey well, and even people who continue to admire him as a great liberal, don't know about his life in the 1940s, the formative decade of his political life, the decade when first as the mayor of Minneapolis and then as a rising star in the Democratic Party, he was one of the rare white Americans to really put what we would now call his white privilege at risk and really put his shoulder to the wheel for civil rights. If you made a list of who was there, present out of white America at that time, you'd say Eleanor Roosevelt, Henry Wallace, and I would say foremost Hubert Humphrey. And the list would pretty much stop there, frankly. And so I want to take us back into that period of time for the movement and also for Humphrey himself. And the first thing I want to point out is that you could not find a less likely champion for civil rights. And in this case, I mean the battle not only against racism, but very much against anti-Semitism as well. No less likely a champion than Hubert Humphrey, because Hubert Humphrey grows up in a place that the great moral philosopher George Clinton of Parliament Funkadelic might have said was very vanilla. Specifically Dolan, South Dakota, population 500. 200 miles, 250 miles west of the Twin Cities, out in the wheat fields of South Dakota. That's what Dolan looked like only about 10 years, 15 years before Humphrey's family moves there. Set up by a railroad company so that they'd have a place to ship livestock and grain to the flour mills and the slaughterhouses of the Twin Cities. And it's an extremely homogeneous place. It's almost all Protestant, specifically Lutheran and Methodist, with people whose roots are in Northern Europe, Scandinavia, the British Isles. And Humphrey's family owns the local drugstore, and you can see Hubert there working at the counter, his unpaid labor for his father's drugstore. And for a moment in time, when things were prosperous because grain prices were high, they had the fanciest house in town. You could tell it was the fanciest house, not only because I've been there to look at all the houses in Dolan, but because 1,000 miles from any ocean, it had a widow's walk. And that's where Hubert Humphrey grows up, in a place in which what passes for a minority group is a town of French-Canadian Catholics about 10 miles away. And if it seems laughable to think of Catholics being an oppressed alien minority, keep in mind that the political tenor of places like that was set by William Jennings Bryan, who on one hand was admirable on economic issues, and on the other hand was a raving nativist and bigot when it came to anyone other than Protestants. And so periodically the Ku Klux Klan would pay a visit to the outskirts of Turton, South Dakota, that Catholic town, and burn some crosses just to make sure the Catholics knew they weren't really welcome. But an amazing thing happens when Hubert Humphrey is 11 years old. There's a gravel road being put in, the first gravel road that's ever going to be connecting Dolan, South Dakota to the Twin Cities in one direction and all the way out to Yellowstone Park in the other. And it's going to liberate the farmers there from the monopoly that the railroad companies have had on prices for their grain and for their livestock. And so, of course, there's all this coverage in the local paper of, US Highway 212, the gravel road being put in. And one of the things that, of course, gets commented on is the totally unexpected spectacle of a black-owned graveling company from Omaha, Nebraska, owned by two of these three black brothers, Leslie and Otis Shipman, that's coming in to actually lay down the gravel. Now, Hubert Humphrey is the son of a complicated father. His father, H.H., is partly a bit of a con man. He had made some of his money early in his career selling patent medicines. He's a little bit of the music man, Harold Hill from that great musical. He's the kind of person who thinks, I'm going to get a bunch of opera records because I love opera and sell them to these farmers. Bad idea. ends up with a lot of unsold Caruso discs. But H.H. was also the idealist in town. He was a liberal Democrat in a town full of conservative Republicans. He was an agnostic in a town full of people who went to church either because they were believers or they wanted to go along with the social norms. And he brought up Hubert Humphrey and Humphrey's younger sister Frances to really carry on his ideals. And one of the things he would tell Hubert Humphrey about encountering people who are different from yourselves was, in this pithy phrase, if you treat people like dogs, don't be surprised when you get bit. And so very much his father's son, in fact, the probably too adoring son of his complicated father, Hubert Humphrey, age 11, goes out to meet the Shipman Brothers road crew. And he befriends them, and they befriend him. And at the end of the week, when they're working out there before they go on to their next job in Iowa, when all the workers have their pay envelopes on Saturday night and they go into Doland to spend some money and have whatever kind of good time you could have in a dry town, Hubert Humphrey's side hustle, in addition to working for nothing in his dad's drugstore, is to sell out-of-town newspapers. And these road crew workers buy all these extra newspapers from young Hubert Humphrey, so he'll make some money that week. And they even take him into the pool hall, which is transgression incarnate for Doland, South Dakota. And then they go on, as I said, to their next job in Iowa. But Humphrey remembers this episode decades later when he's dictating the recordings that will be the basis of his autobiography. And I don't mean to say that if you befriend some black workers at age 11, it's going to make you devote your life to civil rights. If it was that easy, we'd have a lot more white folks who would have devoted their lives to civil rights. But it does tell you something about Humphrey and his temperament and some of the foundations in his view of the world that he would have done that at age 11 and remembered it all these decades later. But what happens is, in his idealistic evolution, is the Depression. Humphrey goes to the University of Minnesota to start school. Already in 1929, already his family is in a precarious situation because throughout the 1920s, crop prices have plummeted in the Dakotas. Farmers can't sell their crops for what it costs to put them in. Banks are failing because the farmers can't pay their loans. Small businesses like the Humphrey drugstore are going out of business, as it indeed did, because people simply can't afford to buy what they want to buy. People who are going to the Humphrey drugstore, like giving H.H. a chicken or a side of beef in exchange for what they need, and he's floating them to his credit thousands upon thousands of dollars of credit. And so then when the whole country plunges into the Depression after the stock market crash in 1929, by the next year, Hubert Humphrey has to drop out of college, go back to South Dakota. His family's moved to a different town, trying to start up a new drugstore, and he has to be their pharmacist. He hurriedly gets a pharmacy license and goes to work there, leaving behind the beautiful University of Minnesota campus and all of his hopes. And in South Dakota, then the scenes we're familiar with from the Great Depression hit: the dust storms, more bank failures, massive unemployment. And this is making Hubert Humphrey a new dealer at a very early age. He is seeing, and in fact he'd begun to see even in the 1920s, that there's a need for activist government to balance the scales. That when families lose their homes, when farmers lose their land, when banks go bankrupt, it's not just because people made a bad decision or a foolish loan or planted too much wheat. That even if those decisions had some small role, there are these meta forces that are at work. They're beyond anyone's individual control. And it takes government to come in and rectify and to solve those wounds. And that's where Humphrey becomes a new dealer at this very early stage in his life. And in that moment, the second really transformative event in his life happens. It's the summer of 1935, and you would think that all Hubert Humphrey is going to do is be a small-town pharmacist for the rest of his life. And in fact, H.H., in a somewhat domineering way, has this grandiose plan. This time it's not Caruso Records. This time it's about running for governor of South Dakota, another hopeless scheme. And his idea is that Hubert Humphrey will work for his campaign, and Hubert Humphrey will be subordinated to his political dreams. Well, that summer, there's supposed to be the first ever Boy Scout Jamboree in the United States outside of Washington, D.C. And Hubert Humphrey is the scoutmaster in Dolan, South Dakota. And he's planning to go to D.C., and then there's a polio outbreak, and the whole Jamboree gets canceled. But he decides to go anyway. And when he goes to South Dakota, he stays with his amazing younger sister, Frances, who's really more like his older sister. When Frances saw the Depression forcing Hubert and another brother, Ralph, to drop out of college, she understands what it means. She's like, if they're not letting the boys stay in college, they're definitely not going to let the girls stay in college. So she makes her way to Washington, where an uncle lives, puts herself through George Washington University, gets a degree in social work, and gets discovered by Eleanor Roosevelt. And when Hubert Humphrey is visiting Frances in the summer of 1935, they go to the Smithsonian, they go to the monuments, they watch Congress in session, and Hubert Humphrey is writing these letters to this young woman, Muriel Buck, his girlfriend back in South Dakota, on fire. And he's saying, I know you'll think it's crazy, but I think I want to go to Congress someday. I want to have a life of public service. And Muriel is the one who says to him something he can't bear to say to himself. She says, first of all, your dream is my dream, and I share it. It's our dream. But if you don't leave your father, you'll never have that dream. He can get another pharmacist, but you have to break away. And it's really only fortified by his now wife, Muriel, that Hubert Humphrey is able to break away. And he goes back to the University of Minnesota, and after a 5-year interregnum of the Depression, finishes his bachelor's degree. Gets that degree in May of 1939. He's already 28 years old. And already married, he and Muriel have their first child, and he wants to go to grad school. And they're pretty much living hand to mouth, and now also that they have a child, Muriel, who's always had office jobs to help bring in money for their household and help support Hubert's academic work. He's working part-time too in a series of drugstores in the Twin Cities. Now she can't work full-time because of their baby. And in the midst of this, Louisiana State University offers Hubert Humphrey $400 as a graduate assistant to come to grad school at LSU. Now, if you get on one of these apps and convert $419 to what they'd be in 2023, it's a pretty significant amount of money. And so for that reason alone, Hubert Humphrey goes to Baton Rouge, goes to LSU for what will be the most important year of his entire life, the year that makes Humphrey the person we know at his best. Because you see, when Hubert Humphrey goes there, he's going as a standard issue New Dealer. He worships Franklin Roosevelt, and he sees politics purely through the prism of economic inequality. That's a real issue. I'm not gainsaying that, but the limitation of the New Deal and of FDR was not to want to go into other areas of inequality, such as racism, anti-Semitism, anti-immigrant feeling in this country. This is what Humphrey becomes alerted to. We might even say, and I refuse to give up on this word, woke to, in 1939, 1940 in Baton Rouge. For the first time in his life, going there to the university that had been built up by Huey Long, the complicated governor and senator from Louisiana, he's plunged into a Jim Crow society for the first time, where he and Muriel and their daughter Nancy live in Baton Rouge near downtown, is separated by 1.5 miles of Baton Rouge's main black community, nicknamed the Bottoms, from the LSU campus. So every day, going back and forth, Hubert Humphrey is seeing in a granular, tactile, palpable way what life is in a Jim Crow society. And it's not just the things that we all have in our image bank, the back of the bus, the separate water fountains, the separate bathrooms. All that is true. He remarks on it. But he also really pays attention to these individual acts of degradation. He pays attention to the black pedestrian who's crossing a street too slowly for white motorist satisfaction, and the white driver suddenly out of his car raining down the N-word on him. He pays attention when he goes with one of his professors to the state capitol in Baton Rouge, which Huey Long, in his arrogance, has built into a skyscraper, and watches black people afraid to get into the elevator if there are any white people in the elevator. What would befall them if they had temerity to share an elevator with a white person? That's what sticks with him. And it offends something in his basic morality, in his basic decency. Less expectedly, when Hubert Humphrey's in Baton Rouge, he meets Jews for the first time in his life, particularly a friend of his on the debate team, a guy named Alvin Rubin, birth name Avraham Rabinovitz, the child of an immigrant from Lithuania. And Alvin Rubin tells Humphrey about his 5 uncles who were trapped in Lithuania at this time during the Nazi-Soviet pact as Stalin and Hitler are carving up Eastern Europe between them, and the peril that they're in. And all 5 of those uncles will ultimately be exterminated. And this begins to sensitize Humphrey to something about the Jewish experience in the world, and both Europe but also in the United States. And it begins to make him an interventionist at a time when America, from the right and the left, is isolationist. On the right, it's the nativism. We don't want to fight Europe's war. What do we care about what happens to those Jews in Europe anyway? From the left, when Stalin made his pact with Hitler, suddenly the Communist International, the Comintern's party line that was sent out to the communist parties in the West, including the US, goes from the Soviet Union is the tip of the spear, the vanguard in the anti-fascist movement, to don't get involved in a capitalist war. So now all the people on the left are isolationists too. But Hubert Humphrey is becoming an interventionist. And what ties it all together is this amazing man, Rudolf Eberle. Rudolf Eberle is a sociologist who'd been at the University of Kiel in Germany, who had been so distressed by the sudden rise of the Nazis in this country that he considered enlightened and cultured and decent and tolerant, that he began doing research to answer the question, how could we go from a democracy to a dictatorship in just 3 or 4 years? How does that happen? And that already puts Rudolf Eberle on the bad side of the Nazi regime. But to add to it, when, like all people in public life, he has to supply a family tree, it reveals one Jewish great-grandfather. And of course, to the Nazis, it didn't matter that the Eberles had converted to Christianity long before then. A Jew is a Jew. And so because of his bloodline and because of his daring scholarship, Eberle is stripped of his academic position, all of his assets in Germany are seized, and at least instead of being sent to a concentration camp, he's put into exile. And he and his wife Franziska and their 3 little kids end up in 1938 on the docks of Baltimore, wondering, where do we go now and how do we make a living? And to its credit, LSU offers him a position, not a professorship yet, but a job as an instructor. And Humphrey is taking a year-long seminar with him called Social Movements. And in that seminar, Eberle does 3 things. Number 1, he talks about the findings of his research. He talks about the way the Nazis picked off one vulnerable group, and then each vulnerable group after that had thought they wouldn't be singled out, of course, is singled out. He talks about the complacency of the establishment there. He talks about the collaboration of establishment conservatives who thought, well, we can sort of use these Nazi thugs, as our fist to intimidate the unions and the leftists, and we'll still control them, but of course, the tiger always ends up riding you. You don't ride the tiger. So Eberle's talking about that. Eberle talks about his own family's experience of dispossession and exile and life as refugees. And Eberle explicitly says, the plight of Jews in Germany is the plight of blacks in the Jim Crow South. That just knits it all together for Humphrey. And finally, Eberle, one day in seminar, casts his gaze across the dozen students and throws down the gauntlet. And he says, if we were in Germany, maybe 2 of you would have stood up to Hitler. And I think Humphrey takes that as his mission statement, as his challenge, to be one of those 2. And so a lot of people from the North, New Dealers like Humphrey, would have left that year at LSU and wiped their brow and said, "I'm so glad I'm going back to the enlightened North and leaving the benighted South behind." For Humphrey, it's the opposite. It's as if now he's been given a pair of glasses and he can see for the first time what's been hiding in plain sight in Minneapolis all along, which is an awful history of racism and anti-Semitism. He had been oblivious to it, partly because he was absorbed in his studies, partly because he was busy being a new husband and father, partly because he was back in South Dakota for those 5 years. But throughout the 1930s, Minneapolis had been putting together a notorious track record for intolerance. If you see that crowd there on the photo that's on your left, those are the good people of a South Minneapolis middle-class neighborhood on a summer night, July 1931, besieging the house that a black postal worker has just bought for his family. And they'll be there night after night, surrounding the house, vandalizing it, killing the family dog. When September rolls around, or late August in the Midwest and school starts, that family's daughter will need police protection to go to kindergarten. And ultimately, they'll succeed over a few years in driving the family out. That's in the North. Up in the upper right, all the people wearing their logo gear, that's a group called the Silver Legion, more popularly known as the Silver Shirts, explicitly modeled on Hitler's paramilitaries, the brown shirts. They had a welcome mat out for themselves in Minneapolis. When they held meetings there, those meetings didn't just attract the riffraff. The president of the Board of Ed went to their meetings. The president of the Industrial Association went to those meetings. The doctors, the dentists, the teachers went to those meetings. And then, of course, you have Charles Lindbergh, Minneapolis's aviation hero and the face of the isolationist movement in America, the one who gave the notorious speech in Des Moines, Iowa, when he said the only people who wanted America to get into war were the British, the Jews, and the bankers. And of course, as far as Lindbergh was concerned, the Jews and the bankers were synonymous anyway. And then this last person who set the tone of religious life in Minneapolis, Reverend William Bell Riley, the most important fundamentalist minister in America between his protege, William Jennings Bryan, and Riley's protege, Billy Graham. For all the decades in between, Riley is the leading fundamentalist in America. And as you can even sort of tell from that portrait, he deports himself in a certain way. He doesn't want to be one of those jackleg preachers foaming at the mouth. He's got a pocket square. He's wearing a three-piece suit. He's erudite. In his sermons, he knowledgeably quotes Plato and George Bernard Shaw and Shakespeare. He's an institution builder. Not only does he build up his First Baptist Church in Minneapolis, he establishes a college and a missionary training institute and a publishing house. And he also happens to be an absolute true believer in the protocols of the Elders of Zion, the forgery that comes out of Tsarist Russia that purports to show how Jews are trying to take over the world in revolution. And he repeatedly speaks and writes about it. And I want to share with you some of the homiletics of William Bell Riley. He tells his congregation one day, fact number one, the Jew fingerprints of the protocols are in every nation on earth. Fact number two, the representatives of this race are at the elbow of every great ruler on earth, dictating national policies. The protocols present a definite plan to have every movement that would stall the political maneuvers of Jewry, labeled, air quotes, he uses them, persecution, in order to blind the soft-hearted Gentile nation until the communist coup is accomplished. When you have the most established, respected minister in town sanitizing that kind of Jew hatred, it makes it permissible for it to be in the public discourse. And when people tried, out of the black community, out of the Jewish community, outside journalists, to say to establishment in Minneapolis, you have a problem with hatred in this city, it was always, oh no, just a few people who were kind of off their nut. You know, the good, decent people of the city would never participate in those attitudes, but of course they did. They gave it a wide berth. And that's what Humphrey comes to find. And now he can see it. And when he gets to Minneapolis, the education he started to get from Rudolph Eberle and Alvin Rubin and the black community in Baton Rouge is continued by these two remarkable men. Cecil Newman, there on your left, is a former Pullman porter who is the founder, publisher, and editor of the major black newspaper in Minneapolis, The Spokesman. Still, I'm proud to say, published to this day by his granddaughter, Tracy Williams Dillard. This man, Sam Shiner, had gone to law school, got a law degree, but because he was a Jew, no law firms would hire him. So while Cecil Newman's putting out his newspaper, Sam Shiner is making his living as a jazz pianist. And ultimately, in the late 1930s, when the Jewish community of Minneapolis is alarmed by all the Silver Shirts rallies and by the dismissive lack of concern about them on the part of mainline Minneapolis, they pulled together enough money to give Sam Shiner a salary to be basically a one-man anti-defamation league. And Sam Shiner sends spies to William Bell Riley's worship services, spies to meetings of the far right-wing organizations in Minneapolis. He subscribes to magazines on the far right, slightly altering his name so it sounds more German, making it Schreiner rather than Shiner. In fact, it's almost serial-comic. One day, an editor of one of those magazines, I don't know, it's like Ku Klux Klan Illustrated or whatever, shows up at his front door, like, "Hi, I'm in town, and I need a place to stay, and your husband's a subscriber." And Sam Shiner isn't there, but his wife is, and she says, "Well, no, actually, we don't have room tonight." But Shiner is doing intel work, and he's trying to alert the newspapers and the police and the law enforcement system, the judicial system, to what's percolating in Minneapolis. He can't get any traction because the Jewish community is small and fundamentally powerless. Cecil Newman is using the pages of The Spokesman to call out every form of racism in Minneapolis, the police brutality that, yes, anticipates George Floyd's murder all those decades later, labor unions that won't have black members, breweries that won't hire black workers, newspapers that use coded language to play on stereotypes of blacks as immoral and criminal on the rare occasions they report on the black community at all. And Cecil Newman also, representing a numerically small community, is fundamentally without power. But here comes Hubert Humphrey. And Humphrey needs them to be his teachers. But what they get from Humphrey is access to power. Here at last is someone who's sympathetic, a white man who's sympathetic, but also has political ambition, political skill, and ultimately political power. And that's going to change the face of Minneapolis and ultimately the United States. And of course, undergirding all of this, in the ambient radiation around all of this, is the Nazi regime, the evolving final solution. And it's not just Jews like Sam Shiner who are paying attention to this. Cecil Newman is also paying attention to this. And Cecil Newman, in his editorials, is constantly drawing the parallel between the oppression of Jews in Germany and the oppression of blacks in the United States. He's constantly pointing out how much Hitler's policies are modeled on what the Germans learned from American eugenicists and from the Jim Crow system in the South. At one point, when he's writing about an example of an attack against blacks in this country, he says, Hitler must be laughing. He must be laughing because of the hypocrisy of America to think it's so different. So that's part of the backdrop. And it's also part of the motivation. When I talked earlier about the Double V movement by black GIs, that is the beginning of the moral force behind the civil rights movement in the 1940s. That we're going to go to this country and fight for this country no matter how it's treated us and leverage our sacrifice to call on this country to be a better version of itself. And Cecil Newman's own son, Oscar, his one child at that time, is drafted. And Cecil Newman will never write more eloquent words than the words he writes in an editorial called War Gets Close to Home in 1943. He says, "Now that our pride and joy is wearing a uniform, getting ready we hope to do his best for the greatest nation on earth, our personal approach to the war and victory is no longer academic. It's a task to talk to a Negro boy who's been South and who has seen how people of his race are treated, and who is cognizant that democracy means one thing for whites and another thing for Negroes, though America hypocritically contends the same democracy embraces all people. Attempting to give a Negro boy headed for the Army or Navy a pep talk filled with platitudes that sound empty, that are empty, is a task which is great. And that's what Cecil Newman is writing. But he urges his son to go and fight. And he says, and fight, pray, and hope that the sacrifices you and others will make will help raise our common country in reality to the lofty heights it espouses. And for Jewish soldiers, there's a similar idea. They don't have a term as wonderful and eloquent and pithy as double V, but they have the same idea that they're going to serve their country and come back and demand an end to Jew hatred in this country. And not long after Cecil Newman wrote that editorial about his son, a Jewish GI from Minneapolis named Marvin Hork is writing in the Rosh Hashanah edition of the Jewish paper there, the American Jewish World, and saying, my only hope is that the spirit shown by us in the war effort will forever blast away the myth that a Jew in the Army has to have an office job. I hope we will forever blast away the theory that the Quartermaster's Corps is the, quote, Jewish infantry. We are out there to do our best, to be a credit to our race and to our country. And that's all part of this evolving, emerging, burgeoning movement for civil rights. And Humphrey is very aware of it, and he's very aware of the importance of the war to it. And in fact, it frustrates him enormously that he keeps getting deferred from the draft, partly because he has a double hernia, partly because he has, by this time, 3 young children, and he's already in his 30s. And he even goes to Washington at one point to present himself as Marine Corps headquarters to ask if he can be taken in, and he's turned away. And he's wondering, what is my role? What can I do? I'm not fighting. And he actually expresses it in letters to people. And the answers he gets are going to really direct the course of his post-war life. One of the people he corresponds with is a young German Jewish refugee named John Neumeier, who makes his way out of Germany really the last minute, 1938, ends up in Minneapolis, where he has relatives. And because he speaks fluent German like a native speaker, is assigned by the Army to be an interpreter at a POW camp for German captives in Nebraska. And he got to know Humphrey as a volunteer in Humphrey's unsuccessful 1943 campaign for mayor, his first campaign. And so he and Humphrey are corresponding, and Humphrey at one point pours out his frustrations about not being able to serve. But here's what Neumeier writes back to him. He says, I believe that you could do a lot more good outside the Army than inside. For as you can imagine, most of your personal initiative would be taken away, even though you might be assigned to an executive position. And if you should be assigned into some line outfit, I dare say, with all due respect to your possible shooting abilities, that a man of your abilities and liberal attitude can fight fascism on the home front better than on the battlefield. In the barracks, opinion runs as follows. It's all the fault of those goddamn Jews. Or you have to show those sons of bitches N-words where their place is. Or we're just in this war to save the British Empire. Many of them, and he's not talking about the German POWs here, he's talking about American soldiers, many of them are usually militantly intolerant. And Humphrey takes that to heart. And Humphrey's best friend from his undergraduate years, Orv Freeman, who later became a Secretary of Agriculture and a governor from Minnesota, he's in the Marines in New Guinea, and he writes this letter to Humphrey. This is about 2 weeks before Orv Freeman gets half of his jaw blown off in battle. He says, I'm sitting here long after taps, trying to read by inadequate candlelight. I'm thinking about war and peace, about what the future offers. I know that you are making many speeches. I wish you could include this letter in them. People at home are trying to help the war effort and the boys overseas. The biggest way they could help is in preparing themselves intelligently for the peace to come. Many of the long, lonesome nights we spend clustered around foxholes, waiting to dive in when the bomb starts to fall, are devoted to discussing post-war problems. And we would like to feel that those at home are trying to prepare themselves by intensive study. And I mean study, and not the palliative too busy. This is by no means intended to be an emotional plea, far from it. But only through democratic process can we hope for peace and to participate in there. Cars are forced off the roads, and when there's a mass meeting of the Jewish community there, and a rabbi says in so many words, what exactly have our boys been fighting for overseas? The incumbent mayor and the police chief say, oh, this is just teenage hooliganism. And Humphrey comes in and says, no, it isn't. This city has been told for decades it has a problem with racism and anti-Semitism and did nothing about it. It was inevitable that it was going to turn violent, and now it has. And in that same period of the campaign, something else happens in the black community, which is that one night this abusive, bigoted police force, on the pretext of looking for a murder suspect, sends an inspector and uniformed officers down to bust into a cafe that's owned by a civil rights activist, a friend of Cecil Newman's. And when they bust in there, they demand everybody's identification cards, draft cards, driver's licenses, and a couple of women refuse to give it, and they're taken down to be arrested. But unfortunately for the cops, one of them works for Cecil Newman's newspaper. So she calls Newman, and Newman calls Humphrey, and Humphrey inserts himself into that controversy and gets the charges dropped. So these kind of efforts are all around the time when Humphrey is campaigning. And incredibly, in a city that's maybe 3% cumulatively black and Jewish, and even if you add in the Catholics, that brings it up to maybe 15 to 20% non-WASP. That's not a winning coalition. But Humphrey is able to kind of grab the moral force of the moment, grab the attention of these returning GIs who have feelings like John Neumeier expressed and Orr Freeman expressed, and put together a winning coalition. And once he gets in, he takes on racism and anti-Semitism in two ways. He knows you have to change laws, but you also have to change minds. On the law front, he pushes through one of the nation's first really hard-hitting laws against employment discrimination, a law against housing discrimination. He starts to reform the police force, a process, unfortunately, he ascends into the Senate too quickly to ever finish, and we're living with the consequence of that unfinished police reform effort in the 1940s. But he wanted back then to send every police officer in Minneapolis for human relations training. He wanted every police officer to have to carry around a human rights ordinance in their hand to refer to. And he also knows you have to change attitudes. And so he brings in one of the most eminent black scholars in the country, a sociology professor from Fisk University, the HBCU in Nashville, Charles S. Johnson, to run a self-survey, which means they're going to get volunteers from the community, like the woman in those newspaper photographs, to go around and both collect anecdotal evidence of bigotry, but deliver surveys that will be tabulated to people in all facets of Minneapolis life: education, religion, recreation, law, business, etc. And what it yields is what we would now call a database. And it's a database that incontrovertibly shows how deep-seated prejudice is in Minneapolis. And that also gives Humphrey the leverage to get a recalcitrant city council off its collective rear to pass some of the laws that he wants passed. And you know, he's a popular mayor, but these are bold stances to take at this time. And Humphrey nearly pays for those stances with his life. All through late 1946 and early 1947, hate mail, threatening mail is coming to him, members of his Human Relations Committee, his wife. At one point, the police interrupt Humphrey while he's out to dinner one night and said, "We've found out about a plot against your life. We're going to escort you home." Humphrey is not deterred by this. But then one morning in February, or late night, almost midnight, 1947, February, he comes home from his typical mayoral night on the rubber chicken circuit. Weirdly, the street light nearest his house is out. So in the dark, Humphrey's leaning over his front door, fiddling with the key, trying to let himself in. And all of a sudden, 3 bullets whiz by his head. Muriel's been waiting up for him, and she gets the door open, tugs him inside, and the two of them try to figure out what the heck just happened. And Muriel remembers something very interesting, which is that their pet dog, Tippy, had barked right before the gunshots. And what they theorize is that Tippy's barking had broken the concentration of the shooter. That's the only reason the shooter missed. And Hubert Humphrey, in a way that would be impossible now, keeps this out of the newspaper for weeks. But meanwhile, the police are working the case and working what turns out to be a parallel case involving the posting of hateful flyers around liberal churches and the University of Minnesota campus. And it leads then to this fellow, Maynard Orlando Nelson, who's a follower of this man, Gerald L.K. Smith, founder of the America First Party, a Protestant minister, a man with whom Humphrey had already had many public tangles, at one point telling him that you can't be a good Christian and hate Jews because Jesus was a Jew. Something that just bugs out Gerald L.K. Smith. Gerald L.K. Smith's program, by the way, included sending blacks back to Africa and putting Jews in quarantine and then sterilizing them so they would ultimately die off. Nelson was a follower of his. Nelson corresponded with the most racist member of the House of Representatives, John Rankin of Mississippi, with the notorious white supremacist group, the Colombians, based in Georgia. And the police, when they arrest Nelson, find guns, knives. Of course, one of his guns is a German Luger, but of course, a map of how World War III is going to take place. And it's certain to me that this is the man who tried to kill Hubert Humphrey. Even though Humphrey decides not to press charges, I think he didn't want to give Nelson a chance to be a martyr at a trial. I think he also hoped that Nelson, because he was facing other charges, would leave Minneapolis, which he does. As I know from his declassified FBI file, he ends up in Chicago, where he affiliates with George Lincoln Rockwell and the American Nazi Party. And so as Humphrey is building, this amazing track record on civil rights in Minneapolis, it's against the backdrop of what's happening nationally. And I've talked about Double V a couple of times. The tragedy, or one tragedy among so many tragedies in the Black American experience, is that the second V doesn't come true. Quite the opposite. When black GIs come back, especially to the South, in their uniforms, and try to register to vote, and try to order food through the front door of a restaurant, and sit in the front of the bus, they're attacked. Some of them are killed. In the most notorious case, this Army sergeant, Isaac Woodard, when he gets off a bus in South Carolina to look for a restroom to use, is set upon by the local sheriff, who not only arrests him, but gouges his eyes out with his nightstick. And Isaac Woodard becomes a national symbol. Instead of being intimidated by that, he travels the country speaking on behalf of civil rights. And even Harry Truman, who's been fairly timid on civil rights up to this point, Harry Truman, who has Confederates and slaveholders in his family background, starts to move forward on civil rights. He appoints a Civil Rights Commission that comes out with a 10-point program. Truman speaks at the Lincoln Memorial to the NAACP, first American president to ever do it. And it looks like things might be moving forward at last. But then Truman looks at his calendar and he sees November 1948, when he's going to run for election. And he decides that he better do what Franklin Roosevelt always did, which is appease the Southern racist wing of the Democratic Party. Not take up civil rights, let them have their segregation, or as they called it, states' rights, in exchange for their votes on Election Day and their support in Congress. And when it comes to July 1948, and this sweltering week in July when the Democratic National Convention is going to take place, there's no doubt that Truman will be nominated. In fact, the party is very morose about it. Everybody expects him to lose. The battle is whether the Democratic Party will at long last endorse civil rights. And in that battle, there are four stakeholders. One is Harry Truman, who's let it be known he doesn't want any civil rights language in the party platform. Another, led by this man, Mississippi Governor Fielding Wright, and that one, South Carolina Governor Strom Thurmond, are the so-called Dixiecrats, the southern wing of the party. And they make it known, if there's word one about civil rights in this platform, we're walking out. And they're so serious about it, they already have railroad cars sitting at the station in Philadelphia waiting to take them to Birmingham for a Dixiecrat Party convention. And their plan is not some idle protest. They want to win enough states in the South that neither Truman nor Thomas Dewey on the Republican line will have a majority, And what happens then? It's what certain people wanted to have happen in 2020. It goes to the House of Representatives. And who's going to hold the pivotal votes there? This block of Dixiecrat Congress members. They're going to choose the next president. And the price will be letting Jim Crow go on. And then you have the amazing A. Philip Randolph, literally outside Convention Hall, holding protest marches every day as part of his ongoing campaign, urging young black men not to register for the draft and not to serve if called up until Harry Truman desegregates the armed forces. Because incredibly and utterly hypocritically, this army that went to war against forms of racial and religious intolerance, exterminationist intolerance, was itself segregated and remains so by now 3 years after the end of World War II. And the last faction is this group of liberals with Hubert Humphrey, one of their leaders, who've decided we're going to bring this fight to the convention floor no matter what. And it's a risky fight. Harry Truman's point person in the convention, a senator from Illinois, says to Humphrey in so many words, if you make that speech, your political career is over. Truman is writing in his diary and saying these civil rights advocates in the party are crackpots. That's what he calls them, crackpots. And even so, and even against the threat of the Southerners to walk out, Humphrey is going to give that speech. And so on July 14th, 1948, 60 million Americans listening on radio, 10 million watching on this newfangled thing called TV, which has started to become available in the Northeast. Here Humphrey gives his speech. And it's a speech in which Humphrey makes the case against the hypocrisy of a liberal New Deal party accepting segregation. It's a speech in which he makes the geopolitical argument that in the Cold War, when we're asking soon-to-be decolonized black and brown countries around the world to choose between Marxist-Leninism and Western democracy can't include tolerance for segregation. And it's also a speech in which he delivers these two turns of phrase that he's been fine-tuning for months ahead of time. In one of them he says, for those who say that we're moving too soon on civil rights, I say we are 172 years too late, which goes back to 1776. And in the other phrase he says, for those who say that this is an infringement on states' rights, I say the time has come for America and the Democratic Party to walk out of the shadow of states' rights and into the bright sunshine of human rights. And that speech incredibly carries the day, over and against Truman's opposition, over and against the threat of the Dixiecrat walkout, which does occur, and who leads it? None other than Bull Connor, later the police chief of Birmingham, Alabama, notorious for his fire hoses and police dogs in 1963. So they walk out. But an amazing thing, and what it forces Harry Truman to do is run as a civil rights candidate, something he'd wished to avoid. 2 weeks after the convention, Truman issues executive orders desegregating the armed forces and desegregating the federal workforce, two gigantic landmarks. On election day, he wins his upset victory over Tom Dewey. He wins it for one reason, a surge of black voters in swing states. His electoral college margin comes from black Americans. And the reason they voted for him is because of the civil rights plank that Hubert Humphrey and his allies and the outside pressure of A. Philip Randolph and his mass movement put on Truman. And it sets the table for we're going to get to that, for the civil rights laws that Hubert Humphrey and Lyndon Johnson working the inside game and Martin Luther King and the Freedom Movement working the outside game are going to accomplish. The Civil Rights Act of '64, the Voting Rights Act of '65, the Fair Housing Act of '66, LBJ's eloquent speech endorsing affirmative action at Howard University in 1965. All of that is the outcome of what Humphrey and his allies achieved in 1948. But if only the news were solely good. But it's not solely good. Because out of 1948, when the Dixiecrats make their exit, that's the first step towards becoming Republicans. The white racists of the South become Goldwater Republicans, Nixon Republicans, Reagan Republicans, and ultimately Trumpist Republicans. And we see the results of that to our peril to this day. On the Democratic side, it's the opposite. Out of 1948 comes the Democratic Party that we know and recognize today, a party with whatever flaws it contains of interracial, interfaith democracy, of commitment to inclusive democracy. The party that gives us not only the civil rights laws I mentioned, but 2 terms of Barack Obama. New leaders, Hakeem Jeffries as Speaker, or now Minority Leader of the House, Kamala Harris as your Senator and now as Vice President. All of that's the outgrowth of 1948. And again, the battles of 1948 go on. Progress is always contested. One thing I've come to believe writing this book is that American history is a cycle of oppression, resistance, liberation, progress, and then backlash. After Reconstruction, after mass immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe, after the civil rights victories of the 50s and 60s, and of course, we should have predicted it. How could I have been that stupid not to know what was coming? After 2 terms of Barack Obama and his coalition and the Supreme Court declaring constitutional right to marriage equality, we should have known what was coming. And so we have these battles again, the battles that have been horrifyingly embodied by the murder of George Floyd, by the Unite the Right rally, by the attempted coup. And, you know, in one interpretation, maybe that means Humphrey failed at everything, along with, you know, Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and Eleanor Roosevelt and everybody else who tried to make progress. Maybe it's all hopeless. I don't believe that. But I do believe that because there's always that backlash, the battle always has to be fought anew. That we're called to join that battle as defenders of democracy and all forms of equality repeatedly, because we have to hold the ground that we've won and try to extend that ground. And I think Hubert Humphrey is a great example of that. You know, he was mocked a lot for his ebullience, for his optimism. He talked about the politics of joy. He took on the nickname that was first applied to one of my political heroes, Al Smith, governor of New York, of the happy warrior. And people remembered the happy part, and in the era of the counterculture and then the sour aftermath of it, that seemed unbelievably corny. But remember the other word that went with that, the warrior. And he was a warrior. He was someone who couldn't be intimidated by an assassination attempt. He was someone who was willing to defy a president, even when he was told it would be the end of his political career. And so, with both joy and happiness, but also with a warrior spirit, Humphrey is calling on all of us to continue his work today. Thank you.